In 1790, the United States Congress passed a law that had never existed in any democratic republic before. They called it the Census Act, and on paper it sounded simple. Count the people, know the population, allocate the seats in Congress accordingly. Clean, logical, constitutional. Except that is not what happened. What happened instead was one of the most systematic government-funded erasure operations in the history of the modern world. And by the time most people figured out what the Census Bureau was actually doing, the evidence it was designed to destroy had already been buried, sold off, reclassified, or quietly transferred to institutions that most Americans have never heard of and cannot access. This is not a story about counting people. This is a story about what they found when they started counting and why that finding terrified the people in power enough to build an entire federal bureaucracy around making sure no one ever talked about it again. If you want to understand what the Census Bureau was really for, you have to start with the buildings, subscribe, and hit the bell. What we are about to cover goes deep, and every piece connects to the next. By the mid-1800s, census enumerators were traveling across the continent, documenting something that did not fit the official story of American settlement. They were finding structures, large, permanent, sophisticated structures in cities, towns, and territories that were supposed to be newly settled frontier land. Stone buildings with arched entryways, post offices with granite facades, municipal halls with vaulted ceilings, courthouses with design complexity that no frontier community of 300 people had any business possessing. The 1870 census alone documented over 400 public edifices across the American interior that enumerators described in their own field notes as of uncertain origin or predating known settlement records. These field notes were collected, catalogued, and then, in 1880, the Census Bureau underwent what officials called a modernization of record-keeping systems. Virtually all pre-1880 field documentation from interior territories was reclassified or destroyed. That was not an accident. That was a decision. To understand why that decision was made, you have to understand what those buildings represented. Because scattered across the continent in the mid-1800s, in places that American settlers claimed to have only just arrived in, there existed an architectural vocabulary that matched nothing the colonists had brought with them. The domes, the wide promenades, the uniform street grids in cities where no urban planner had ever worked, the covered arcades, the public baths, the rail infrastructure that supposedly required decades to build, appearing fully operational in territories that had been settled for less than a generation. The official explanation, the one taught in schools, is that early Americans were simply excellent builders who worked very fast. That frontier communities, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, somehow quarried, transported and erected granite public buildings with neoclassical proportions and load-bearing structural integrity that modern engineers still study as examples of precision craftsmanship. Think about what that actually requires you to believe. A farming community of 400 people, with no heavy equipment, no established supply chains, and no trained architectural workforce, built a domed municipal hall with a foundation depth of 12 feet, a rotunda diameter of 60 feet, and exterior stonework that has survived 150 years of American weather without significant structural failure. Not once, not in one town, in hundreds of them, simultaneously, across a continent. The census enumerators saw this. They wrote it down, and their documentation was taken from them. Here is where the structure of the Census Bureau becomes important, because the Bureau was not simply a counting office. From its earliest years, it was also a classification office. It determined what information went into the public record and, more critically, what information did not. The Bureau had the legal authority to decide which data points were relevant to national population analysis and which were tangential. That word, tangential, appears in census administration documents from the 1850s onward with remarkable frequency whenever the subject of physical infrastructure documentation came up. Buildings were tangential. Architectural histories were tangential. Records of what structures existed before formal settlement surveys were tangential. People were counted, everything else was managed. And management, in the language of the 19th century federal bureaucracy, was a very specific process. It meant that information flowed upward into the Bureau and did not flow back out. State census offices collected data. That data was forwarded to Washington. Washington determined what portion of that data became published census results and what portion became internal administrative record. Internal administrative records in the pre-digital era had a very simple fate. They were stored, transferred, or destroyed at the discretion of the Bureau Director. Between 1850 and 1910, the Census Bureau had 11 different directors. 7 of them implemented significant record revision programs during their tenure. The official justification in each case was administrative efficiency, storage constraints, outdated methodology, the need to standardize data collection across a rapidly expanding nation. In practice, what was standardized was the story. Because here is what was happening in parallel to all of this administrative efficiency. Photographs were being taken, not by the government, by private individuals, traveling photographers, local historians, amateur documentarians who had access to wet plate and later dry plate photography. And what they captured in American cities throughout the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s tells a story that the census records were specifically designed to prevent. The photographs show cities that do not match their official founding dates. Chicago in 1871, the year of the Great Fire, had a downtown infrastructure density that city planning historians have struggled to reconcile with the city's official founding date of 1833. 38 years of development does not produce what those photographs show. The scale, the uniformity, the permanence of the built environment in those images reflects a city that had been a major population centre for far longer than 38 years. When the fire came and the rebuilding followed, much of what was rebuilt went directly over existing foundations. Foundations that no one asked questions about, because the Census Bureau had established officially that Chicago was a young city with a documented history beginning in the 1830s. The documentation said so. The documentation was managed. New Orleans presents a more complicated case. The city's official French colonial founding dates to 1718. But the street grid of Old New Orleans follows a logic that French colonial town planners of the early 18th century did not use. French colonial settlements followed military fort design principles. Rectangular grids radiating from a central defensive position. Old New Orleans does not do that. It follows a radial pattern centered on what is now Jackson Square, with intersection geometries that match the urban planning conventions of a much older and more sophisticated municipal tradition. The 1850 and 1860 census records for New Orleans originally included a section on existing civic infrastructure. That section was not included in the published results. The field documentation was classified as internal administrative record. It no longer exists in any publicly accessible archive. By the time the Bureau finished its work, the story of American cities was settled. Cities were founded on known dates by known people for known reasons. The built environment that those founders encountered when they arrived was not part of the record because the Bureau had determined it was tangential. But the buildings were still there, and some of them required explanation. The explanation that emerged and that the census infrastructure helped to legitimize was the World's Fair theory. Beginning with the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia and accelerating through the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the official story began to take shape. All of that domed and columned and arcaded architecture that existed in American cities before anyone could quite explain why was reframed as exposition culture. Temporary structures built for fairs, plaster and steel framing, built fast, demolished faster. This explanation has 3 significant problems. First, many of the buildings in question predate the fairs by decades. They appear in photographs and land records and insurance surveys from the 1840s and 1850s, 30 and 40 years before the expositions that supposedly inspired them. Second, temporary plaster and steel construction does not produce the structural signatures engineers have documented in these buildings. Materials analysis of surviving structures has returned results consistent with permanent load-bearing masonry. Limestone, granite, sandstone, not plaster. Third, fair organisers kept detailed demolition inventories of everything built, leased and torn down. The buildings that appear in pre-exposition photographs of American cities are not in those inventories, because they were not exposition buildings, they were already there. The Census Bureau did not create this explanation, but it created the conditions under which the explanation became unchallengeable. Once the official record establishes that a city was founded in a given year, and once documentary evidence of what existed before that year has been classified or destroyed, there is no institutional mechanism for challenging the founding date. That is precisely what a bureau designed to manage information produces. Not truth, finality. In the decades following the Civil War, the Bureau's scope expanded. The 1880 census introduced new categories that had nothing to do with population counting. Agricultural surveys, manufacturing inventories, infrastructure assessments. These categories created a legal framework under which enumerators could enter properties, document physical structures, and forward that documentation to Washington without any obligation to share results with state or local authorities. What came back in terms of publicly released data was economic, production capacity, employment figures, output measurements, the physical description data, the field surveys documenting what enumerators actually saw across the interior of the continent, went into the administrative record. They do not exist in any public archive. There is a document, however, that does exist. A letter, dated 1882, from the Superintendent of the Census to the Secretary of the Interior, concerning what the Superintendent describes as anomalous infrastructure discoveries made during the 1808 enumeration. In it, the Superintendent describes enumerators in 4 separate territories, reporting structures of unclear provenance and significant antiquity that could not be reconciled with known settlement histories. His recommendation was not to investigate, it was to flag the relevant field surveys as requiring special administrative handling, transfer them to a restricted access category within the Interior Department, and ensure that published census results reflected documented settlement history as established by formal land grant records. When what the enumerators saw contradicted the official story won. That letter exists. It is held in the National Archives, accessible to researchers with appropriate institutional credentials. It has been cited in exactly 3 peer-reviewed academic papers in the last 40 years. In each case, the citation appears in a footnote, because the infrastructure it references is not supposed to exist, and so the document that proves it was found and suppressed sits in an archive in Washington, correctly filed, properly catalogued, and almost entirely unread. The Census Bureau did not build the structures that do not fit the story. What it did was far more consequential. It created an institutional mechanism for deciding permanently and officially which version of reality became the record. It established the legal and administrative framework under which inconvenient information could be classified, misfiled, or simply not published, without any of that suppression ever needing to look like suppression. It looked like bureaucratic efficiency. It looked like data management, the normal functioning of a government agency doing exactly what it was chartered to do: count the people, manage the record, settle the story. There is one more thing worth noting about the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The official story holds that its designers created the entire built environment from nothing in 2 years, 200 buildings, hundreds of acres, a complete water and sewer infrastructure, all of it between 1891 and 1893, 2 years. And then, officially, most of it was demolished, burned, torn down, converted. Except that some buildings shown in 1893 exposition photographs still existed on the south side of Chicago in 1900. In 1910, into the 1920s, not as preserved landmarks, as ordinary buildings with addresses appearing on insurance maps that the city officially did not know what to do with because they fit no category in the municipal record. The Census Bureau counted the people who lived near those buildings. It did not ask questions about the buildings. That was always the point. The real reason America built the Census Bureau was to create a single, authoritative, legally binding version of the national story. And in that version, certain things do not exist. Certain histories did not happen. Certain buildings were never there. The question is whether you trust the documentation or whether you trust your own eyes when you look at photographs of cities that should not look the way they look in years when they should not have been able to look that way. Both cannot be true. One of them is the record. One of them is the reality. The Bureau was built to make sure you never had to choose, because by the time you got the chance to look, the record would already be all there was.